Good afternoon and good morning. Welcome and thank you for joining us. Today's webinar, one in a series of COVID-19 related webinars, focuses on therapies and vaccines. My name is Laura Tobler and I will be moderating the webinar today. I'm the Director of NCSL's State Policy Research Division. As the U.S. leads the world in the number of documented COVID-19 cases, development of and access to treatments and vaccines is an increasing priority across public and private sectors. Experts from NCSL, the Food and Drug Administration, and the pharmaceutical industry will discuss current treatment options, progress in development of new therapies and vaccines, partnerships, and other innovations in the pipeline to combat the novel coronavirus on this webinar today. Today's webinar is a platform for information exchange and engagement, and we hope that it answers your questions and provides new information. Speaking of questions, please use the chat box in the lower left-hand corner of your screen to submit yours to our presenters. We encourage you to type in your questions and answers if you have them throughout the presentation. Many of you will want to download the slides for today's webinar. You can find a PDF version of the slides by opening the tab labeled Resources. The tabs are found just above the presentation window. Another tab is labeled Speaker, where you can read the bios of today's speakers. You can access these tabs at any time during the presentation. If you have trouble downloading the presentation, please email me at laura.tobler@ncsl.org, and I will send you the deck of slides. Today's webinar is being recorded and will be available on NCSL's website within the next few days. I'm thinking maybe Monday or Tuesday of next week. So the National Conference of State Legislatures is the bipartisan organization that serves the legislature, legislators and legislative staff of the states, commonwealths, and territories. NCSL provides research, technical assistance, and opportunities for policymakers to exchange ideas on the most pressing state issues and is an effective and respected advocate for the interests of the states in the American federal system. NCSL developed a webpage to house our comprehensive resources on the state and federal response to COVID-19. Here you can find archives of previous webinars and a significant amount of information on policies and responses related to the continuity of government, education, fiscal, elections, criminal justice, public health, and other important considerations during this unprecedented time. Today, we have 6 presenters who will share their expertise with us. Remember to click on the speaker tab to read bios. We have Haley Nicholson from NCSL, Dr. Anand Shah from U.S. Food and Drug Administration, Ann Pritchett and Scott Lagenga from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America, Brett Michelin and Ashley Van Meter from the Association for Accessible Medicines. On deck first is Haley Nicholson, Senior Committee Director, Health and Human Services, NCSL State Federal Affairs Division in our DC office. She will provide a broad update of the FDA's work related to COVID-19 therapies and vaccines. So take it away, Haley.
Thank you, Laura, and good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to quickly cover a few topics because I'd like to give as much time as I can to Dr. Shah. So currently, the FDA has created a special emergency program for possible COVID-19 therapies. It's the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, also known as CTAP, and this program falls under the Center for Drug Evaluation and Research. So they're working on these therapies and other issues like clinical trial conduct, drug shortages, fraudulent activity, drug imports, among many others. With the CTAP program, they triage the requests from developers and scientists that are working to develop or evaluate the new therapies, and they put in touch with an FDA staff agency person, usually within a day. And this work is including prioritizing products based on their scientific merits and the stage that they're at in development, along with a quick protocol checking within about 24 hours of submission in most cases. CTAP support includes redeployed medical and regulatory staff, involved senior management, and operations and policy staff, and they're all working to streamline the processes and operations for developers and scientists, as well as healthcare providers and researchers that are looking to develop these therapies. As of this week, the number could have changed. I got this a few days ago, but FDA has been working with companies to identify potential new treatments with about 284 clinical trials underway, along with 10 therapeutic agents in active trials and another 15 that are in the planning stages. On the vaccine front, the FDA has been working to help accelerate development timelines to enter into clinical trials in humans as quickly as possible. And last month, they met with the European Medicines Agency to look at facilitating the development of these vaccines. And in the meeting was discussed and emphasized heavily the importance on having preclinical data and ensuring that those that would undergo a clinical trial are not exposed to unreasonable risk. On my last slide, so this is everything I just covered. And on our final slide, I encourage you to look at FDA's webpage. They update it daily. They have a lot of great information on these topics and other topics that they're working on. And also NCSL has a daily federal agency announcement page, including FDA's announcements that we try to put up as quickly as we can. And with that, I will hand it off to Dr. Shah. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Haley.
Go ahead, Dr. Shah.
Oh, thanks very much, Haley. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm Anand Shah, Deputy Commissioner for Medical and Scientific Affairs at the FDA. I'm responsible for oversight of our medical and scientific operations, including high priority policy initiatives that cut across the agency. I appreciate the opportunity to provide an update on our critical role to combat COVID-19, and I really want to thank NCSL for inviting FDA to share for a few minutes today. First off, I want to briefly highlight a few areas of work that are going on at the FDA right now with regard to treatment and therapeutic vaccine development for COVID-19. On the topic of drugs and treatments, as most of you know, at this time, there are currently no FDA-approved drug products to treat COVID-19. That said, we have been working tirelessly to facilitate the development and availability of therapeutics for the use by patients, physicians, and health systems as expeditiously and safely as possible. On March 31st, as Haley alluded to, FDA stood up a new program to expedite the development of new treatments. This is known as the Coronavirus Treatment Acceleration Program, or CTAP. We're using every tool available at our disposal to bring new therapies to sick patients as quickly as possible. We're doing this in a way that supports high quality, rigorous research to evaluate whether these medical countermeasures are safe and effective for treating patients infected with COVID-19. We're maximizing regulatory flexibility, providing ultra rapid advice and review. Generally, we're aiming to review IND protocols in under 24 hours, compassionate use request in under 3 hours. Those are our goals. We have received hundreds and hundreds of incoming inquiries from every corner, not only of the United States, but even globally. We're streamlining our processes internally in operations so that when developers and scientists send inquiries and requests, we're making sure that they're getting very quick turnaround. And there are a number of therapeutic areas that we're evaluating. So antiviral drugs like remdesivir that might treat the specific virus, drugs that inhibit certain receptors that might be helpful in reducing lung inflammation and improving lung function in COVID-19 patients. We're looking at therapies such as convalescent plasma and hyperimmune globulin. We recently issued a guidance on April 13th around investigational convalescent plasma. These are blood products that are taken from blood donated by people who have recovered from the virus that could potentially shorten the length or lessen the severity of the illness. We are continuing to look at existing therapies such as chloroquine and hydroxychloroquine. As many of you are aware, these drugs have received significant national media attention. And so really, our work here requires striking the right balance between aggressively supporting innovation and ensuring that Americans can trust the drugs that they take. And so we are working with all sectors to expedite the development of numerous innovative treatments and preventions. Our colleagues, I believe, from PhRMA are also on the line, and we have had several touch points, with industry partners here, company CEOs, making sure that there's a bi-directional communication with therapy developers with the FDA. Just a few points around vaccines. Currently, there is no vaccine that is labeled to prevent COVID-19. That said, we're working with a host of vaccine developers and other researchers, manufacturers, to help expedite the development and availability of vaccines and antibodies. On March 18th, FDA and the European Medicines Agency, or EMA, we jointly chaired the first global regulators meeting to discuss regulatory strategies to facilitate the development of a vaccine. And here, really, the goal was to promote, to the extent possible, regulatory convergence, streamlining our processes, and minimizing duplicative processes as we look towards developing a vaccine. We had more than 60 experts representing 25 agencies in 17 countries in that meeting, and that included the World Health Organization. We've been working with a number of manufacturers here domestically: New Jersey-based Janssen Research Development, Moderna of Cambridge, Massachusetts. The Janssen phase 1 clinical trial is set to begin no later than fall of this year, with the goal of making a COVID-19 vaccine available for emergency use by early 2021. FDA continues to work with BARDA, which is the HHS Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority. So jointly with BARDA, we're working with companies to streamline the development and regulatory processes and looking for whole-scale vaccine targets. We're intending to use all the regulatory flexibility granted to us by Congress to ensure that we have a efficient and timely vaccine onto the market. And with that, I'm going to pause. I want to thank you again for your engagement on this topic. We very much look forward to working with NCSL going forward. We're grateful for the partnership, and thank you for the opportunity to share today.
Thank you, Dr. Shaw, for taking the time to be with us today and for that excellent update and presentation. We will be compiling questions for Dr. Shaw and responding to those via email at a later time. Our next presentation is a duo, Ann Pritchett, Senior Vice President of Policy and Research, and Scott Laganga, Senior Vice President of State Advocacy, both from the Pharmaceutical Research and Manufacturers of America. They will be discussing the pharmaceutical industry's response and some of the factors affecting it. Ann and Scott, I'll turn it over to you.
Great. Thank you, Laura. And let me also, on behalf of the biopharmaceutical companies, the 34 innovative companies that make up PhRMA, I want to first thank NCSL for this opportunity and for pulling together this discussion, and all of the presenters are a part of it, including our appreciation to Dr. Shaw and FDA, as well as our colleagues over at AAM. And we know, in particular, we want to thank state legislators, all of those joining us today from around the country, for your efforts on behalf of your constituents. You know, it's our hope that this can serve as a resource for all of you based on the questions and challenges that constituents are facing, and similarly put you in a better position to help answer some of those questions at a time during this crisis. So our companies, researchers and scientists are very hard at work, as Dr. Shaw had illustrated. I actually grew up with the biopharmaceutical industry. I lived in the medicine chest, as it's known in New Jersey. And I have to be honest, I've never been sort of prouder and excited about where the science is, and more importantly, the work that's ongoing by all of our companies at this time. And so we'll be discussing a number, each one of these areas in a moment. But let me highlight why I think the industry at this point is uniquely positioned to respond rapidly to COVID-19. The industry first has had deep scientific knowledge gained from decades of experience with similar viruses like we've seen with things like Zika, MERS, and SARS. Second, the industry has invested billions in technology that has dramatically shortened the time it takes to decode viruses. And this is very important as we look to the development of a potential vaccine. It is also why we have many of these existing treatments on the shelves in clinical trials already, as Dr. Shaw had mentioned. And then finally, biopharmaceutical companies are really the ones able to rapidly scale up production facilities to manufacture at the right scale the vaccine candidates or treatments that we're hoping for. So right now we have more than half of our members are researching and developing vaccines and treatments and testing existing medicines, and my colleague Ann Pritchett will discuss that further in a moment. There's also significant and enormous upfront costs and risks associated with responding to public health emergencies like this, given that there are many uncertainties, and yet the industry does remain committed to the challenge. Our companies have continued to provide lots of different resources and support, including monetary and in kind. And this has included a lot of the headline discussions that we all know about around supplies. This is advanced surgical equipment, personal protective equipment, critical medicines, etc. And then finally, our industry is collaborating, as Dr. Shaw and others will mention, with the FDA, NIH, CDC, all relevant agencies, both here in the U.S. and abroad, to further accelerate the development of new vaccines. And so with that, I will turn to my colleague, Ann Pritchett, who can highlight the sort of tremendous R&D efforts that are currently underway.
Great, thank you, Scott. Wanted to give you a sense of, as Scott mentioned, the factors that are contributing to our industry response, the importance of developing new diagnostics, assessing existing medicines to see where they may be appropriate, researching new treatments, developing vaccines, and as Scott indicated, being able to ramp up our manufacturing in a quick manner. I wanted to give you a sense of the overall pipeline. I know this was mentioned at the outset. There are currently more than 300 global clinical trials underway for COVID-19 treatments and vaccines, and kind of these numbers are changing by the minute and every day. As you can see, the pipeline includes both vaccines and treatments. We need both. We want to prevent infection, but we also need to treat those who are infected. And part of the reason, as has already been mentioned, why there are so many trials underway in such a short period of time is that our member companies very quickly scanned their R&D and product libraries to identify projects for other infectious diseases that might be applicable. But that's just part of the equation. We have to conduct clinical trials to see if they are safe and effective and to determine the appropriate dosing. Our companies also are sharing learnings from clinical trials in real time with U.S. and other government agencies, FDA, EMA, and others, as well as sharing information with other companies so that we can collaborate and seek to accelerate the development of new treatments. Our industry is continuing to do everything we can to beat this virus as quickly and safely as possible. In terms of pharma member R&D activities, Scott mentioned that at least half of our member companies have R&D projects underway. So wanted to just give you a sense of a little bit of what our companies are doing and what's in the pipeline. A number of our member companies, including J&J or Janssen, have vaccine candidates in development, and J&J is one of the ones that's sharing technology with other companies that allows you to use less of a vaccine. So it's enabling us to conserve doses. We have companies like GSK and Sanofi that are collaborating on vaccine R&D efforts and working together to ramp up manufacturing capacity. This can be a multi-year process, which is why they are starting now at risk. In terms of treatments, several different approaches are being explored. You have kind of, as the slide indicates, antiviral drugs that target the virus and prevent it from replicating. Think about HIV drugs. Gilead's drug is among those furthest along in the pipeline, and it's been used to treat patients with COVID-19 on an emergency basis. And we're starting to see that real-world data that's going to inform potential approval. We also have antibody drugs that are being explored by member companies like Amgen. And these types of medicines seek to help the body fight infection and potentially reduce the risk of contracting COVID-19. So this is a strategy that was used with great success against Ebola. So these medicines can be used to prevent infection for those at high risk of exposure and can also be potentially used in infected patients. Another approach that's been getting a lot of attention is being tested by Takeda, and that's a blood plasma-derived treatment. And this works by concentrating the pathogen-specific antibodies from plasma that's collected from recovered patients and then transfers those antibodies to a new patient, which may in a concentrated form. And this can help that person's immune system respond to the infection and increase their chance of recovery. And the focus right now in clinical trials is determining what's the optimal concentration to be effective. And then I wanted to take a moment to speak a little bit about vaccines. Our colleagues from the FDA spoke to this as well, but we often get asked, what is the timeline for a new vaccine? I think most importantly, we can't always predict how individual immune systems are going to respond to a vaccine, and that's why we need to run large clinical trials to establish safety and efficacy in patients. So the typical timeline for a new vaccine can be a decade or more, but we've had a head start here in terms of the time frame based on the very short amount of time it took to sequence COVID-19. So it took 4 months from sequencing to the first human study of a vaccine, which is a huge time compression from what we've seen in other instances. And in large part, we've been able to rely on the decades of expertise and investments that our companies have made in terms of responding to other infectious diseases, and that's allowed us to rapidly scale up and accelerate R&D efforts. And so what we're looking at in terms of a best case scenario is 18 to 24 months for a potential vaccine to be approved. But it's very important to note that the failure rate for vaccines can be up to 94%, and that's why we need so many shots on goal. And that's why it's so exciting to see so many different vaccine and treatment candidates in the pipeline, because we do have very high failure rates. There's a lot of risk, there's a lot of uncertainty. But that's why it's great to see so many companies stepping up to the plate, so to speak. And then finally, before I turn it back to Scott, I did just want to take a few minutes to speak to the overall drug supply chain, as I know that's a key area of interest. As this slide indicates, our member companies work very closely with FDA to prevent and mitigate potential shortages, and we're required to report a lot of information about potential shortages to the FDA, including the reason for the shortage and the expected duration. And our member companies have extensive measures in place to manage the various elements of their supply chain. And this includes inventory management systems that incorporate and plan for anticipated demand. They reflect the historical knowledge of the demand and supply environment, and they incorporate contingency plans. And these contingency or risk management plans and systems include plans for additional or alternative manufacturing sites, and this might be through self-owned sites, existing stock reserves, and or a range of global external suppliers. Our companies are working hand in glove with FDA and others in the supply chain to address the localized surges in demand that we've been seeing that have led to some localized shortages. And if an individual company needs to shift from a low to a higher volume manufacturing line, the FDA has been working very closely with us to expedite the review and approval of such changes. And given many of the drugs experiencing surges in demand are generic, the FDA is doing everything it can to prioritize reviews of new generic drug applications and expedite changes in manufacturing to address the increased demand. And I would just, in closing, note that PhRMA and others involved in the drug supply chain, including FDA and AAM, that we are we're having weekly drug supply chain calls with FDA and other agencies across the administration that gives us an opportunity to raise and address potential concerns, including concerns around, in some instances, inappropriate stockpiling of medicines that contributed to localized shortages, particularly as it relates to certain antibiotics. And we have concerns around inappropriate prescribing of some drugs that are still being studied for potential utility in COVID-19 that are leading to shortages for patients with legitimate medical needs. And we've also been using this as an opportunity to talk about issues that could lead to potential disruptions in the supply chain, For example, we want to ensure that shelter-in-place policies don't impede our ability to provide critical medicines to patients. And with that, I'll turn it back to Scott to talk about some of the resources that we have available, and I look forward to the question and answer time. Scott?
Great, thanks, Ann. You know, as we know, with the crisis as it's unfolded, constituents that you all represent are still facing more and more challenges around healthcare, particularly around access and issues around affordability. And so we know that all of you need to be in a better position to help and want to have answers. And here are a few tools that we just wanted to highlight that we think can be of a resource to you as you talk with those folks. First, this is an effort the industry built in the last year around called our Medication Assistance Tool. And our Medicine Assistance Tool is an online platform with the purpose of helping patients and caregivers and other healthcare providers to learn more about what resources are available to help them in assessing and affording their medicines. And so as you can see, and we highlight here, there's a number. This is a very simple exercise. You can visit mat.org and select whether or not you're a patient or a caregiver, and then enter the name of the medicine for you or a loved one, and we'll be connected to information sharing about important items associated with the product, the list price of the medicine, what are the average estimated out-of-pocket costs, and any other cost-related information that helps patients better understand what they're going to need. In addition, let me mention our industry's work with an effort called Healthcare Ready. This was established by PhRMA and the American Red Cross and other trade associations following the aftermath of Hurricane Katrina. And the organization serves as this sort of central coordination point for the healthcare supply chain and government agencies like FEMA and Homeland Security and FDA. We know many of you are probably getting flooded with calls about constituent concerns around access to medicines, and we know that many of you have been working on ways to help with medical supplies and personal protective equipment. So Healthcare Ready can help serve and field these requests. You can actually just email that email address right there, alerts@healthcareready.org. And with that, those donations are working hopefully to meet the ongoing needs that we see throughout the crisis. Furthermore, we have now several programs with Healthcare Ready that can help your constituents. There's the RX Open effort, which will help constituents identify where pharmacies are open in their area. There's the Prescription on the Run, a wallet card template to help them with the relevant medical information. And all of these resources are available directly through that website. So we encourage you to stay informed and to use this as a resource for your constituents in the months to come. Lastly, you can go right to the PhRMA website, and we have a web page entirely focused on coronavirus with information about our member companies and their efforts, as Ann had outlined, and of relevant tools and information that would be valuable for you and the constituents you serve. And then lastly, this is just an overview that we will leave, as this is going to be a published webinar. And these slides are information of our team who's here to help. And so we would just say, feel free to reach out based on the region of the states to our individuals listed here. And we are happy to help in any way we can to help serve you and your constituents. And with that, Laura, I can turn it back to you and to the NCSL team.
Thank you so much, Ann and Scott, for that terrific information and presentation. I'm sure it generated questions from our participants. Please submit your questions by typing them in the chat box in the lower left corner of your screen. I think we have some time just to break up the presentations. We have some time to ask a question now. And I'm to go back to Terry Ryan's question. Yesterday, it was reported that Oxford University is testing a vaccine that could be available by August of 2020. This would be an incredibly rapid turnaround for a vaccine. Could you comment on that? Ann or Scott?
I'm sure. This is Ann. I haven't seen that particular study. So I do know that a lot of the news articles have been conflating when a vaccine is ready to go into clinical trials versus when it's going to come out of clinical trials. Our understanding from all the best knowledge we have is it takes about, it's going to be 18 to 24 months before we see a vaccine. But as our FDA speakers noted at the beginning, that the Janssen vaccine candidate might be available earlier for emergency use. I don't know if that was the particular vaccine that was cited in that article.
Thanks. One more question. It's a question from Senator John, I'm sorry if I don't pronounce your last name, Bison, who is from Michigan. What is the actual number of weeks or months on the fast track program? Is this a question for Dr. Shaw or for Haley? No one?
Sorry, I think when you're, well, do you want me to, this is Ann, do you want me to try and answer that? So I think the question is when something has been prioritized by the FDA, what does that time frame mean? So the FDA is condensing the time frame in terms of reviewing new vaccines and treatments for safety and efficacy. The review process they're shortening, as well as prioritizing getting, approving those to go into clinical trials. But we're not condensing the clinical trial period for new medicines at this point.
And this is Haley. As I said, and then Dr. Shaw also mentioned in the CTAP program that when people are submitting for, developers and scientists are submitting for therapies, they're generally getting like a 24-hour turnaround of a response. But yeah, as far as building out for those longer clinical trials and timelines, I can't speak to the weeks or months on that piece.
Thank you. We're going to continue with our presentation now. So our next presentation is also a team of two. Brett Michelin and Ashley Van Meter are both Senior Directors of State Government Affairs for the Association for Accessible Medicines. And one of the issues they say their members are addressing is how COVID-19 has affected access to treatments. Brett and Ashley, the screen is yours.
Thanks. I'll go first. I'm Ashley Van Meter. I am the Senior Director of State Affairs for the eastern part of the country. Primarily, we represent all the generic and biosimilar manufacturers and distributors in the nation, and approximately 90% of the prescriptions dispensed within the United States come from our members. We are facing unique challenges as COVID-19 pandemic has progressed through the last couple of weeks and into the last couple of months, with our manufacturers of generic and biosimilars having to work around the clock to ensure that we can continue to provide the 9 out of 10 scripts that our members dispense throughout the country. Although the global pharmaceutical supply chain has become strained under different stresses that we've seen, not just on medicines that are currently being used for treatment and possibly alleviating symptoms of COVID-19, but also folks wishing to get greater supplies of their medicine so they don't have to leave their house, has really put pressure on our members, our manufacturers, to ensure that they're working and progressing and moving forward in even a 24-hour kind of timeline as far as what's been happening in each of our manufacturing facilities. We've worked, Brett and I have worked with probably almost all 50 governors in all of your states over the last few weeks, trying to coordinate them with our members, ensuring that if there's medicines that are needed, that information gets relayed back to working groups and back to FDA, also back to members. We've been incredibly proud of the work that many of our members have done over the last several weeks in ramping up production and truly trying to meet the surge in demand. Many of our members have donated millions of doses of medicine, medical equipment, including PPE and also ventilators, as well as working to ensure not just the health and safety of patients, but our very own workforce and also those of our local communities. I'd just like to highlight a couple of the things that some of our members have been doing over the course of the last few weeks. We've had many members, as I've said, donating hundreds of thousands of masks. For example, 3M doubling its global output of N95 respirator face masks, getting them to healthcare providers on the front lines of the pandemic. Accord, one of our members, UK Arms, had donated 2 million doses of hydrochloroquine to Britain's National Health Service for use around the world in one of the world's largest trials. Also, one of our members, Sandoz, has donated 130 million doses of hydroxychloroquine sulfate to support clinical trials that are going on, and 30 million doses to the Strategic National Stockpile, as had one of our members, Sun Pharmaceutical, donating over 2.5 million doses of the medicine. We've also had many of our companies, for example, Lupin had donated 10,000 N95 respirator face masks to hospitals in Florida, Maryland, New Jersey, New York, and others, as well as Amneal donating 1 million dosage of potential COVID treatment hydroxychloroquine sulfate to the Texas State Pharmacy for direct distribution to hospitals, 2 million doses to New York, and 400,000 doses to Louisiana. And so we've also seen Alteva, one of our larger members, donating 10 million doses of the medicine to hospitals nationwide. And some of our associate members, for example, Direct Relief, providing personal protective equipment and essential medical items to healthcare workers, delivering protective masks, exam gloves, isolation gowns, healthcare organizations in areas that are confirmed COVID-19 hot zones and have many cases of the virus. Also, we've worked with Operation Smile in donating gloves, masks, ventilators, hospitals in Virginia, activity in mission countries to get CPAP helmets for non-invasive ventilation to hospitals in Italy and across our country, as well as delivering meals to folks that are not able to get out because of being either quarantined or have some other medical condition. As I had mentioned, a lot of this has meant that our members have had to ramp up production of not just the medicines here, but also medicines, for example, heart medicines, also anything for high cholesterol, those sorts of things. We've seen folks needing to go from 30 to 90-day supplies, and it's somewhat we face unique challenges because somewhat our supply chain is similar in some instances, but very different from our branded counterparts. And for that, I would like to hand it over to my colleague Brett Michelin, who's going to have a conversation with you all about the unique nature of the generic pharmaceutical supply chain.
Thank you, Ashley, and thank you to NCSL for taking the time and the legislators from across the country that are watching or will be watching as this is recorded. I really want to just do two main points. One, a high-level overview of who the particular players are within the supply chain. It's a question that we're often asked, and it's not just as simple as drugs are made by manufacturers and distributed through a corner pharmacy. And then second, hopefully not duplicate too much of what Anne talked about, but some of the current supply chain issues that we're facing during this pandemic. As I mentioned, the drug supply from the manufacturer to the pharmacy can take on various different roles and through various different players. Starting with drug manufacturers, we're required and do acquire the materials for drugs through multiple sources. It's a very diverse and globally sourced supply chain that requires a lot of contracts, a lot of interaction through multiple companies just to receive not only the active pharmaceutical ingredients, the API that has been in the media a lot, but also key starting materials and excipient materials such as binding agents, the inactive materials that all go into actually making a pill. Those come from multiple sources, again, from really global assets. From there, once the manufacturers are able to put together a pill and come up with the finished dosage form of the product, on the generic side, we sell to the distributors and wholesalers. And there's really only 3 companies that control 90% and do most of the buying and then the selling of the generic drugs as they move from the manufacturer to the pharmacy. Once the wholesalers purchase the drug, the generic manufacturers are largely out of the business of what happens to it as far as knowing how much is going to go to each individual pharmacy, moving it to each individual pharmacy, how much product will be moved even into a particular state. The three main wholesalers also, they control about, each have about 30 different wholesale locations spread around the country. So 90% of the drugs are going to roughly 90 wholesale warehouses. And as I think Ann mentioned, that's where we've seen some of the localized shortages. There's not been a major shortage of any particular drug with the exception of one that the FDA had mentioned very early on, because there have been massive stockpiles from both that are under the control of the manufacturer, but also in the warehouses of the wholesalers and distributors, plus the stocks that pharmacies have. Pharmacies range from, as most obviously see on every street corner, your local chain pharmacies, but your supermarkets, your nursing homes, hospitals, they all have pharmacies and they all require supplies. The second point, as we move on, a little bit different, is when we add in some of the other organizations, such as the group purchasing organizations. Many states have entered into them as well, but most hospitals, nursing homes, other health agencies have all come together and created these GPOs. They'll negotiate directly with the manufacturers in order to purchase the drugs, which then go to the wholesale distributors and then are dispersed to the various hospitals. Some of the supply chain issues that we have started to see were also witnessed during a fairly massive drug shortage back about a decade ago. So 2009, 2010, 11, there was a shortage. And the FDA did implement, and thank you to the FDA for being on this as well, did implement different procedures that we do go through that require 6 months prior notice or as soon as possible for manufacturers to notify the FDA of any potential shortage. Typically, we give them on the generic side, even if a generic manufacturer is getting out of a particular line of business. So what that does is it gives the FDA the ability to know and to contact additional manufacturers where we can't talk amongst ourselves necessarily because of antitrust concerns, but the FDA can contact each individual manufacturer of a particular drug, determine how much supply there is in the system, where it is, what potential shortages, whether it's just in the API or any of the other material that goes into making a drug, and then go back to some of the other companies that are remaining in or who may not be facing a shortage. And those companies then can look internally and determine if they can increase or ramp up their production. Since this started, we've seen about a 4,000% increase in the demand for the hydrochloroquine. And companies have also shortages of other drugs that have come up or increased demand for like zithromycin, propofol, and some of the other things that are used in the treatment for patients who are on respirators. And through that, they've been able to help the manufacturers balance what needs to be produced, where it's going to be produced, and to help through the supply chain. That does take a lot of regulatory discretion in order for manufacturers to be able to have the ability to simply switch lines of producing one drug into producing another drug. Most generic manufacturers will be manufacturing multiple different drugs at roughly the same time. And so having the ability to take one drug off that may not be under pressure to start manufacturing another drug that is under pressure or under increased utilization demand. It does take a little bit of time, but through our work and partnership with the FDA, companies are able to increase where it's necessary and have that type of information. Again, something we can't do just talking to each other because of antitrust issues. I think one of the primary issues that has come up is in the supply chain has been in transportation. Unknown to most people, a lot of the drugs that are flown around as they're being transported from one place to another, especially coming in overseas, is they're transported through commercial carriers, so commercial airlines. Obviously, with the shutdown and with the pandemic that's gone on, there's been a big disruption of those flights. So we did have some initial problems, and they've largely been worked through. Still, obviously, taking care of some of those issues as they do persist, where new types of flights, whether they're chartered personal jets or other flights that are being scheduled just simply to move pharmaceutical ingredients or finished dosage form pills from overseas to the United States and then throughout the United States. And that largely, I think, covers, in the interest of time, what I wanted to talk about. There are some additional slides on there that discuss the other players within the supply chain, and feel free to look at those as you go. They are all represented by different associations, and I'm sure each one of our colleagues are willing to answer any questions about their particular aspect of the supply chain. I'm happy to turn it back over to NCSL at this point.
Thank you, Brett and Thank you, Brett and Ashley, for sharing that information and for wrapping up our presentations for this webinar. The remainder of the time will be dedicated to Q&A. I'm going to remind the presenters to keep your phone on mute unless you're answering a question, and then I'm going to remind our audience to put your questions into the audience chat, and hopefully we'll get to all of them during the last few minutes of this webinar. So here is a question. The time frame that you've provided for creating a safe and effective vaccine, does that include the amount of time that it takes to produce and distribute it? And how will populations be prioritized for distribution? I'm going to turn it over to whoever would like to take a crack at that one first.
Sure, this is Ann Pritchett. I'll speak to the time frame. So that's the time frame to get to approval. So that's 18 to 24 months for a vaccine for the conduct of clinical trials, and then for demonstration and evaluation of safety and efficacy by the FDA. The manufacturing ramp-up does take a longer amount of time, and that's why, as I mentioned, that several companies are working right now to ramp up manufacturing and build back those capabilities in anticipation of a potential vaccine being approved. And so that's a demonstration of what our companies are doing at risk, because who knows which is going to be the vaccine that's ultimately going to be approved, or if there are going to be multiple vaccines. But given that it does take a long time to ramp up, that's why companies are starting that process now. I can't speak to what the exact indication is going to be on the label for indicated use for any vaccines or treatments, so I can't speak to the exact populations that they're going to be used with or how they would be prioritized. That's something that individual companies and government agencies would be more privy to than I would as representing the policy side of the trade association.
Thank you, Ann. I'm going to go to Kenneth Romero's question. Have there been challenges with participation of Hispanics and African Americans in the clinical trials, as often is the case with the development of vaccines and medications? So can someone comment on that? No takers?
That might be more appropriate for FDA. I would just say, this is Ann again from PhRMA, that we aren't privy to what the individual recruitment processes are for the companies. But I would say that when we're in times of crisis like this, one of the big challenges is that you are needing to test in the infected populations. And what we've already seen in China is that we've had to make some changes in clinical trials there and shut down a site or two because we've lacked available patient population. But I can't speak to what the specific challenges might be for individual companies, but we are aware that that's a ongoing challenge.
Thank you. As you know, our members are serving their constituents in their districts, and they get lots of questions about therapies and vaccines, and you've provided quite a few resources for them here today on the webinar. Can any of you comment on additional resources that they can share with their constituents, and if there's, a go-to resource, perhaps the FDA, that they can be referring their constituents to? I'll turn it over to anyone who'd like to take a crack at that. Maybe we could start with Haley.
I would say I think I'm going to have to talk with Dr. Shaw and his team because I just have kind of a broad understanding at this point. So I would defer to other speakers on more details for that.
So this is Ann. I'll just jump in. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
No, sorry, Ann, it's Scott Laganga, and I would just, first and foremost, I think, and I'm sure Ann would agree with me on this, I mean, one, we would recommend and feel free to utilize and share all the information I kind of reviewed before in terms of the industry resources, many of which tied directly back to the relevant agencies and their information sharing that's been quite successful, including that of FDA. But I would also say the CDC and their COVID-19 page has been an excellent resource as they try to help with the general public in terms of simplifying the discussions, using relevant infographics, simplifying a very complex dynamic right now, which I think is probably quite useful for everyone in your constituents. But again, our resources are there to help in any way possible. But Ann, if you wanted to add anything.
Scott, I think you covered everything in terms of CDC. The one thing I would note is CDC's webpage itself, the landing page, doesn't look different, but it's actually being updated every day. And it includes not just information for you to give individual constituents, but it has lots of information on business continuity plans, what measures companies should consider as they think about reopening their workplaces. So it has resources for a broad range of issues related to COVID-19. So that's kind of, the first stop shop I would recommend. And if you're looking for information on kind of the current status of treatments in development, again, FDA does have a resource page related to COVID-19. And then if you aren't following what Dr. Fauci is saying, you should be, because, there are a lot of articles that come out on a daily basis. I did just look up that Oxford article, and it's talking about where they're ramping up manufacturing, even though the vaccine is still in development and hasn't been approved, which is, an at-risk situation. And so when you're seeing news articles and about different studies and what may be coming tomorrow, I think your best source of information on what could actually be coming is kind of listening to people like Dr. Fauci within the federal government, who are actually in the process of working with companies on the review and clinical trial process for these treatments.
And this is Haley. I apologize. I also just remembered in a conversation too that the FDA intergovernmental team that we work with, they said that they are actually, in addition to what Ann just recommended, and I think I put a link to the FDA site as well for resources, they said they are developing some additional materials that'll be really relevant for state folks, and that should be out next week. So we'll keep everyone posted on that as well. Sorry that I forgot about that point.
Hi, this is Brett from AAM. I would also add FEMA to that. They've got I think a fairly up-to-date website and are populating it with quite a bit of information on the really emergency response, and would note that they've got one link to rumor control, which can be very important, I think, in times of crisis like this, and would allow people, and does allow people to get additional good information of some of what is truly going on versus what is not.
Thanks all for taking a turn in answering that question. I'm going to ask our last question, and for the speakers, it's actually the last question that's in the audience chat box. Is there any protocol or upcoming protocol for prophylactic use of medications for healthcare professionals dealing with COVID-19 patients? Does anyone want to speak to that? No? So go ahead. Okay, so we're coming up to the end of the webinar, and I am very grateful for all of our speakers and the time that they have given us here this afternoon. I'd like to thank our presenters for sharing their expertise on the webinar. I want to thank the audience for participating in the webinar this afternoon and for taking time out of your busy days. Early next week, we'll be posting the recording and the slides of our COVID-19 webinar. To find the archive, just go to our website, www.ncsl.org, click on the COVID-19 resource page and select the webinar tile, and you'll be able to scroll down to today's webinar. Once again, I thank you all for your participation and for the speakers' time and effort in making this webinar happen. And I wish you the best and stay well. This webinar is now adjourned.